As always, our show is sponsored by Memoria Press. You can find our curriculum at memoriapress.com.
Welcome to Classical Etc., a show from Memoria Press that dives into the philosophy, culture, and heart of classical education. You're in the studio with Shane Saxon.
Welcome to another episode of Classical Etc., seated with Paul, Tanya, and Martin. And before we get to our topic, which is Socratic Dialogue, Tanya said that she would fire me if I didn't ask what she was reading. And I don't want to be fired. So, Tanya, let me ask you, what have you been reading recently?
I'm reading Mansfield Park.
Oh, you
which
are?
I promised Lita that I would read.
But you said you hate
my least
It's your least
favorite,
favorite.
Jane Austen, but she thinks it is her favorite. And so we need to have a discussion about it. But so I'm rereading it at this age rather than a young age to see if I like it now.
Okay.
And I can say already I'm about 100 pages in and I do like it much better than I did the first time. I think I was too young the first time I read it, and Fanny just really irritated me, and I didn't have the wisdom really to know where she was coming from or to be able to put myself in her place. I don't know. We'll see. I may get tired of her by the end, but it's a long book.
Martin, have you read Mansfield Park?
You know, I have not read Mansfield Park, nor have I read Persuasion.
Well, you need to read it.
Which after Pride and Prejudice, well, what is it, 4 or 5 books? But I was, after our discussion here, I sort of made the commitment that I was going to.
I've never read it either.
Yeah.
You should read Persuasion and Northanger Abbey before we go to England, because when we go to Bath, those are the two that are set partially in Bath.
Okay,
Oh.
I will do that.
So
This
go
is the
ahead.
upcoming college trip to England.
That's
Yeah.
right. With Joseph Pierce as
Yes.
our guide,
in
a
March.
literary tour.
Mhm.
Wow.
Literary tour, the Shakespeare in the Shire.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Paul, now what have you been reading recently? As in this morning.
Because we're on this breakneck pace of recording podcasts, and I have to read something this morning. I was a little worried, and Martin and I had told Martin recently about a short story that I read from Balzac, The Atheist Mass, and he had told me about another book by Balzac that he listened to. I can't remember what it was titled. So I decided I was just going to search on the library for Balzac, and I'd listen to something on the way in. And the only thing available was in French. It's called Etudes de Femme. And I thought, well, I'll give it a shot. I need to get my French up to date anyway. And it lasted about 5 minutes, and I turned it off and went right back to Graham Greene.
Because of the language, not the writing.
No. I love Balzac in translation. And I'm sure if I read it, if I sat down and was reading the language, it would be fine.
But listening to the speed
of the French narrator, plus his French is a little older, I just couldn't do it in the car.
And I always feel like every time we bring up Balzac, we probably should say Balzac's books are for mature readers because he's French.
Yes.
And they do, have, scenes in it. But
a little
the themes,
racy?
What's that?
Are they racy?
There's part, it's good and evil, and it's Paris, so there are situations in there which are for mature readers, but they're not racy, but
Some of our readers should read it in the French, is what you're saying.
yes, so they won't have to worry about those passages or any other passages.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, Shane, you can move on now. Thank you for letting me get that in. I just really needed to tell
you're
people
welcome.
that
And
I'm reading Mansfield Park.
Happy to do it so that I don't get fired. Now, the question I was going to ask, that I'll ask Martin because he hasn't offered his reading, was, can you tell me about a memorable book reading experience in your life? Now, I know you don't remember much, but that's usually just the last 5 years. It seems like 20 years ago, your memory is crystal clear.
A memorable book reading. Well,
That's what
I
happens
was
when
reading.
you're elderly.
I was reading Charles Williams' book, All Hallows Eve, which is a advanced theological thing, which does deal with the satanic in the book. And I'm sitting there in an airplane reading it, and the stewardess comes and she says, "Oh, what are you reading?" And I just sort of put it, it's All Hallows Eve. She says, "Oh, I'll have to pick that up." And I didn't say it, but I'm thinking, no, lady, you do not need to read this book.
Nice. Well, the topic at hand is Socratic Dialogue. Now, Martin, you mentioned that there's a recent Wall Street Journal article, an opinion piece by Jeremy Tate. He is the CEO of Classic Learning Test.
Classic Learning Test.
Classic Learning Test. And he was responding to this Chat GPT.
Mhm.
Tanya, are you familiar with this?
Yes.
Yeah. So there's a lot of fear that, Chat GPT is going to make writing essays irrelevant. And so Jeremy Tate responds to that by saying Socratic Dialogue is the answer. And in classical schools, we have Socratic Dialogue, and that helps our students.
Yeah. So instead of, and can somebody, Paul, you're the chat guy. What Chat G, just for our listeners who don't know what that necessarily is, right?
I believe it's just an artificial intelligence sort of program that you can kind of plug in what it needs to be about, and it'll just generate an essay for you.
Yeah. So he was responding to this idea that we in a lot of our colleges, and I'm not sure how much we do this anymore because people, a lot of students just can't write, but is grading paper. You get your grade by the papers that you write in the so it's now becoming apparent that this Chat GPT thing is so good at writing an essay that they can't distinguish it from all the mediocre student essays out there.
And the other thing is, I've got a friend who's a high school teacher, and she can easily, if she suspects that a student's paper is on a level that is higher than that student, right?
Normal.
Then she can just put like a paragraph in Google and it'll pull up if it really has been plagiarized. And that's not going to be possible with this. So that's the scary thing, is now you can catch plagiarism if you're a careful teacher, but you're not going to be able to catch it. And I'm thinking,
but you will still see a discrepancy between what that student can do in class. If your class isn't 100 kids, right? In a college, you might have 100, 200 kids. But if you're in a smaller class setting, which Jeremy Tate would probably advocate for, right?
Sure.
And advocating for Socratic Dialogue. But if you're in a smaller class setting, you're still going to say, wow, this student, what they say in class versus what I just got in this essay, there's a discrepancy, but it will be very difficult to pin them and say, you're going to suffer the consequences for this because you cheated.
And that's exactly what Jeremy Tate is going for, is saying you can't Chat GPT your answer in a class. And that's the positive. So I think the rest of our discussion is really going to be focusing in on this concept of Socratic questioning, Socratic dialogue that's been very popular in classical education. And I think we're going to be way more nuanced than typically people are about this concept. But before we get there, first, Martin, can you just kind of expound on the positive aspect of what Jeremy's getting at, and what I think we would all agree on in this table about the way that questioning and what he's kind of intending in that article is really a fruit of real classical education?
Yeah, well, he's dealing with this very specific thing, and he's using it really, I think, as an excuse to talk about discussion, Socratic discussion, and I'm putting that in quotation marks because we'll probably interrogate that notion a little bit, but I think he's using it for that particular purpose, and in saying that you can't get to the students' real abilities until you can actually talk with them, and this is why you read John Henry Newman's Idea of a University, and he gives you these examples of how he examines students orally. He asks them questions. They respond. You can't, like you say, you can't chat GPT that. And so I think Jeremy is right on target there. The problem we run into is when you are so excited about Socratic discussion that you ignore the fact that along with the great books and applied to the great books is what you're trying in a classical education. And Jeremy doesn't really go here, but it is what you're trying to enable students to. You're training them to be able to engage in Socratic discussion at the college level, and even to a certain extent the high school level, and you're training them to read the great books. Those require years of preparation. And so you can't the problem in the classical education movement is that people just want to go whole hog right into Socratic discussion without it preparing their students to do it. And I think that, what we do in our curriculum in terms of just always, starting even in just, asking questions and getting our students answers and all that is part of what we do. In addition to the more not necessarily lecture type, but presenting them with the stuff they need to know at the younger levels. All that is somebody's not going to walk in the classroom thinking, oh, you're doing Socratic discussion. No, but we're preparing them to do it. They have to be prepared. And I think that's kind of our angle. Tanya can correct me. I think that's...
No, I think that's perfect. And I'm glad you started there. And I would like to give an example of what Martin's talking about. So like in Farmer Boy, we might ask, what is the relationship between freedom and responsibility? Mm-hmm. So to ask a third grader that question would be ridiculous. But to say throughout the book for the students to be making a list of Almanzo's responsibilities on the farm, to be to keep pointing out throughout the book as you make a list of all the great food that they eat, and to keep pointing out to students that they are free because they're self-sustaining. So that frees them to be independent. But they have a lot of responsibility in order to get to that freedom. So this is all too much for a third grader, but it's an introduction to it, and we're doing it through story. So we would never say to a third grader, what is the relationship between freedom and responsibility? But by the end of the book, we can do that because
Sure.
we've worked our way there throughout the book.
Yeah. Now, Paul, you have some opinions about this phrase, Socratic questioning itself, and I want to hear you push back on it. But before you do, let's take a quick break.
Free shipping is back at Memoria Press. Your favorite classical Christian curriculum is available now with free shipping the entire month of February. Get Latin, logic, literature, and more with Memoria Press. Visit memoriapress.com to learn more.
Now, Paul, how would you define Socratic questioning?
That's a phenomenal question because it's used ubiquitously in different ways. But I think I would define it as a teacher leading students to a particular value, right? And by doing it in the form of questioning, it leads the student to actually embrace that value for themselves.
Well, and if the purpose or end of Socratic discussion is knowing values, I mean, we also need to. I'd expand that a little bit to say we're talking about what classical education is about is really an understanding of the true, the good, and the beautiful. And so, as ideas and the discussion of ideas, Socratic method is particularly appropriate, as opposed to, you're asking why questions of these things, as opposed to how questions when you're teaching a skill, or what questions when you're just teaching basic knowledge.
So what I have seen implemented in schools across the country is, the same thing, what Martin's talking about, of just jumping in and saying, well, all Socrates did was ask questions, so we just need to let the students ask questions and talk about it, right? It's applied in the form of a conversation, as opposed to maybe a dialectic or dialogue would be better, right? if you go read any of Plato's dialogues where Socrates is the questioner, for one, he's always dealing with adults. Except in one case. And when he's dealing with adults, he will throw a very open-ended question out there. But when he deals with a child, and he gives them a very closed question where all the child can answer is yes or no, basically. And then that's getting the child to engage in this process of discovery, of learning, but it's not letting them go in any direction. And so, I've walked into classrooms before where the kids are all sitting in a circle and the teacher literally is outside of the circle, and it's a free-for-all, versus the teacher who is driving this, right? And I had lots of, if you want to call them Socratic dialogues with my students, but they're all seated facing towards me. I was in the front, and they would say something and I would be able to respond to that. And I'd call on the next student, in random ways to keep them engaged. And we had very deep discussions, but it was all driven by me to get to the point that I wanted to get to. Whereas what Socrates does in his discussions with adults is oftentimes he doesn't come to any sort of truth. At the end, a lot of things of what it's not, but you don't often come to a definition of what it is that they're seeking for, whether it's justice or wisdom or whatever, these questions that he's asking. And so, but he's able to drive a child to, I believe it's the Pythagorean theorem.
Yeah. So on that point, you have this article, The Condemned Teacher.
Uh-huh.
It's on the Memoria Press website from 2017?
5 years ago, I think.
2017.
Where you kind of ask the question, if we are trying to do Socratic questioning, let's look at where Socrates is teaching. And the one place where he's teaching his student is in the Meno, I think is what you point out.
Right. Which I think is I just want to hammer that distinction. We can't deny that children are not adults. We have to affirm that children are not adults. And that's a distinction that is often lost in the pursuit of Socratic questioning. At a college level, great. Like, let's have these discussions, free-for-alls, right?
Well, and we can even, if we've prepared students, so back to Farmer Boy, so we're going to talk about freedom versus responsibility all the way through. We're going to talk about it in Heidi. Then we're going to talk about it in Robin Hood. It's just going to be all the way through. And when we get to upper high school, when we get to Anna Karenina and we say, discuss how freedom and responsibility are related in relation to Lev and his work on the land, they're going to be able to do it because we've prepared them to do it. So at that point, I'd say in our curriculum, at least by high school, we should be able to have real Socratic discussion. But I think the point you made in your article that resonated the most to me is that it's got to be with an end point in mind. There has to be an end goal. This isn't just a tell me how you feel kind of question. It needs to be like you're pointing students to a truth. And so you're giving them, hopefully we've given them the tools to get there.
Yeah, we need to make sure that people don't think of Socratic discourse as an encounter group where everyone shares their feelings. This is what we always lapse into. And what, in many cases, most students, that's all they're capable of at some points in their education. Because if you look at what Socrates was doing, Socrates was extremely directive. All right, he's driving the whole thing toward a certain point that he wants to drive it to. The other thing is, Plato says somewhere that this methodology is only appropriate to mature men over the age of 30. Okay, so we need to remember this when we're trying this out on children.
Wow.
Yeah, because it requires. I mean, you listen to the answers that are given by his interlocutors, and they know something. They're not stupid people. Socrates is smarter, and he, in many of his dialogues, as Paul's saying, they just get to a point where all the theories that anyone has proffered in the discussion are clearly not acceptable, and that's where we leave it, and we go into another dialogue. The other thing to remember is...
Well, I think Tanya was upset with you for not quoting correctly. I think Plato says mature men over 30 and mature women over 18.
Oh, is that what it was?
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
I missed that in the Greek part.
Yeah.
When I was taking my philosophy degree, they didn't mention that. So the other thing is this. Paul mentioned Meno's slave boy, where Socrates is able to get the Pythagorean theorem out of him by a series of questions. We have to remember what Socrates' assumption was in all of this, which was the pre-existence of souls, and that all knowledge was remembrance. So when he's getting it out of the slave boy, it's because he's existed in some prior life, or what is it?
He's contemplated the forms.
He's contemplated the forms in eternity. So yeah. So do we believe that? I mean, we have to.
I'm going to say no. I don't believe actually in reincarnation, Martin. I just want to be clear about that.
Yeah, but I mean, we have to remember what the assumption, what Plato and the character of Socrates' assumptions were in all this. And we don't necessarily believe that all knowledge is remembrance. It's something we actually learn in this life. So, and that doesn't nullify the Socratic method. It just means that when we apply it, we need to remember what Socrates' assumptions were.
Okay. So are you saying that Socrates thought that Minos, that
it's a
already
boy.
had all this
Yes.
stuff inside him because
Because
Well, he and
of what-
Minnow were
It's
discussing
Minos
this.
slave boy.
And-
right, but
yeah.
I mean, I'm confused about the reincarnation thing.
So Plato believed that everybody before they were that well, he believes that we're all reincarnated, but it's sort of in that time period between when you're
Between
alive,
lives.
that in some way you get to contemplate the forms, so the true essence of what exists.
So is that the cave wall thing?
And
It's
sort
what,
of
it's what that's trying to teach you.
yeah. And
Exactly.
so what he's saying is the reason you can question somebody and them come up with something that they wouldn't have otherwise been able to tell you is because you provoked this remembrance of what they had before they were born.
Wow.
Mhm.
I had no idea.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is just to say that we do not, in fact, contain within us all the answers, and that we're trying to. They're near back to the
Speak
encounter
for
group
yourself.
thing again. Okay.
No, but, you know,
yeah.
I feel like they're inside
But
me.
we talk about as iron sharpens iron, right? Like it's in that conversation that we can kind of hone. We can come up to these distinctions and say, well, I didn't actually mean that. And you can hone and
Yeah,
come to
in an
that
adult context. But in education, we are dealing with students who don't know a lot. They are still needing to know the basic knowledge that is required to engage in a Socratic discussion, which is why when I go to a seminar on Socratic discussion, and the whole thing, they didn't apparently notice this, is done in lecture form. I have the question, excuse me, but if Socratic method is so good, and they were saying this should be used even down to the lowest levels, if it's so good, why are you conducting this entire seminar in something other than Socratic method? Okay, so we need to, this whole thing of assuming what children know already is extremely important, and we need to remember that the Socratic method assumes that that you already know a bunch of stuff. I don't,
Well, right, and that's why. I mean, I when I was teaching 7th and 8th graders, like I could start this process, right, in sort of a more dedicated way, where we could spend a significant amount of time doing it, but we were also doing it based on a particular text. So when
that everyone had probably read.
right. Well, we were all reading together,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So for me to reference the Iliad here, that's because we don't all need to sit down and read it because we've all read it, right? It's common knowledge. Whereas we could discuss the Iliad with those kids because we were reading it together. It was off of basic text, but they also had enough knowledge of the Bible, of other literary works, of other history to be able to make outside connections. And that's where I think you can really start seeing that sort of thing happen in middle school and beyond.
I can imagine a Platonist listening to this, and thinking and being outraged because they would say, "Well, isn't it obvious that, or isn't it even Christian to say that students know right from wrong inherently, that they resonate with what's beautiful, that they have some reasonableness within them, and so as we're discussing." It seems like you three aren't denying that there's some knowledge implanted in us by God, like right and wrong, but that there is an impartation of information, and we need to be careful not to take that basic truth of what God has put inside of all of us and take it to its logical extreme, as though every student should know everything about everything when they're in 3rd grade.
We have the faculty of knowing right and wrong that is undeveloped. And the point of education is to develop that faculty through precept and example.
Which means when Jack puts his hand on the hot stove, he will learn right from wrong on that particular point.
Right. There's some experience behind him.
He was not born knowing not to touch that.
Yeah, but that's true. He was born
knowing that I don't like pain.
That's true, but he was born with this. He was born with the capability for guilt, and he was born with the capability of seeing what's true and good and wanting that.
Faculties.
Yep.
Right. That's when you say capability.
I agree with that, but I would reject the notion that we only learn right and wrong through experience.
We develop the faculty through
Correct.
experience. Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
We have the ability to know the distinction between right and wrong, but we have to. It's only through experience that can be developed and perfected, and pushed in the right direction.
and by experience, we're not only saying actually going up and hitting somebody and then getting the consequence, but that in the discussion of a story, we can develop that faculty as well, right?
Well,
As we
but you
just-
can't understand
we-
a story unless you've had some actual concrete experiences yourself. I mean, kids go from the very, very concrete when they're very, very young. Just watch a baby; they're learning the very, very basic stuff through experience, and then they
Yeah.
take that stuff that they learn there, and then they talk about it, and then we learn it more, and we can read
Right,
stories
but
about
it doesn't. Yeah, you don't have to have had every experience before you can actually engage with it in a literature context, right? You don't have to have done what Anna Karenina did to know that when you read Anna Karenina that was wrong.
Mhm.
But do you know that was wrong innately, or do you know that was wrong because of your upbringing?
Well, I think
Yes,
you're also,
yes.
but the literary story allows you to also see the consequences of that.
Yes. So
Right.
you don't have to experience it because you can learn.
Ultimately, if we only knew, right from wrong because of what we were taught, then in various cultures around the world, we would have particular cultural norms
Differences
that would
of-
define morality. And
We
I
would
think-
not have objective right and wrong.
right.
per
And
se.
Lewis's point in Mere Christianity is that there's something inherent in all of us that
Natural law.
understands right and wrong. And I think that's kind of where people in Socratic discussion are going. It's like, oh, we need to help them to, through questioning, find what is put in them through God. But I think the point that each of you have made that's very helpful is that innate awareness, those innate faculties are sharpened over time through instruction in the Bible, in literature, in exposure to truth, goodness, and beauty. And that's the nature of classical education. So I think this transitions to my kind of final question. We could sound like snobs, telling Jeremy that he's using Socratic question
And
wrong.
I'm not saying that.
Right, I don't think we are.
Because he's really, the context he's talking about this in is on a different question. He's also pretty much confining what he's saying to I think older students and even kind of college level students.
So what is the value? Because we have, I've tried to give a training at a school using Paul's condemned teacher. And as I was trying to explain the minnow, it got so confusing that if any of those teachers who were there were listening, they were like, what are you talking about? But we push back on the Socratic dialogue for a reason to help teachers to think through these issues. What's the value in being nuanced? Instead of just using Socratic dialogue as, synonym with discussion, what's the value in nuancing how we use this phrase?
Well, you're going to use the right tool at the right time, right? It's just like if you're trying to screw in a screw, you're not going to whip out a hammer. That screw's not going to go in well. And so
It'll go in, I've discovered.
it's not going to go in well. And that's a great point, right? You might use Socratic dialogue and you might think you got the job done, but maybe you didn't use your class time well. Maybe you have a student who was not prepared for it and is so confused and is going off with the completely wrong idea in their heads because you weren't able to hammer it home.
Oh,
Sorry.
God.
I think that was completely accidental, and you only realized it right in the middle of you saying it. And
You know what? You might be right. So you need to use the right teaching technique at the right time, right age of the student, the right discipline, the right all of that.
I think we just want to be careful that it's like a fad term for classical education, and a lot of times schools will think, okay, we're going to do Socratic discussion because we're classical educators, and they're using it incorrectly. And I think that's what and even in our classrooms, we have to be careful that our teachers aren't wasting time with questions that students aren't equipped to answer.
And I also think we need to put Socratic method in the context of the other two teaching methodologies. Okay, you have didactic instruction, lecture. you have intellectual coaching, okay? And then you have Socratic questioning. And the thing that dictates which one you're using is, number one, what the age of your student is, and number two, what it is you're trying to do. If the purpose is to acquire knowledge, then lecture's a pretty good means, didactic instruction is a pretty good means to do that. If you're trying to teach a skill, then coaching is usually the best method to apply there. Whereas if you're talking about the understanding of ideas and values, which is, again, something that you need a background to do well in the first place, then Socratic questioning is perfectly appropriate.
Yeah.
And I think we probably should talk about the different kinds of questions that show up, but we can do that in a different episode maybe.
Well,
I don't know. We have time.
We have so many episodes. Let's do this. Let's do that one next time.
Okay. Okay.
Give some people a reason to tune back in next week.
All right.
I've enjoyed this conversation about Socratic questioning. Thank you. We'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of Classical Etc. If you enjoyed this conversation, please consider liking this video. If you want to join the conversation, then you can comment below, and if you want to stay connected, please subscribe to our channel. I hope you enjoyed this show, and we'll see you next time.